Hi, my name is Jared Platt, and I am going to talk to you about the tone curve panel inside of the Develop module in Lightroom. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because I think it's underutilized. So I want to introduce you to it and then ask you to play with it. If I go to the contrast knob inside of Lightroom, you can see when I increase the contrast, the shadows go to the left and the highlights go to the right in my histogram. They pull apart. And you can see the effect on the photograph. That is the effect of adding contrast. It's just simply spreading the light and the dark away from each other. The opposite is true. When I move the contrast knob to the left, you see that the piles come into the center, which is removing contrast. That is the most basic way to add contrast, but really the tone curve is where contrast is really well created or beautifully done. So inside of the contrast area, you have several tools that you need to be aware of, and then you need to start playing with them. The first is that you have the sliders down below, is shadows, darks, highlights, and lights. And each one of those operate an independent quadrant of the tone curve. If I go to the shadows and I hover over it, you can see there's a highlighted area that changes as I highlight. So right now I'm highlighting the shadows, then the darks, then the lights and the highlights, and you can see that each part of that histogram is controlled by a different slider. So I can then create much more contrast in the shadows and the highlights, or let's say just the lights, but I can leave the highlights and the darks alone, which gives me a much more subtle way of adding contrast to my photograph. So that's the first way you would work with the tone curve. Secondly, inside of the tone curve, you have three little handles here on the left, middle, and right, and that is just definitions of the dividing line between the shadows, the darks, the lights, and the highlights. So if I click on the shadows and bring them way down, and then I start messing with that divider, you can see how it's changing the photograph, and you can see how it's changing the histogram itself, or the tone curve over the histogram. As I go way to the left, it only affects the bottom 10% of the photograph. If I go way over to the right, it can affect up to as much as 70% of the photograph can be dark. So play around with that and see what you come up with. But generally speaking, I'm going to keep mine around something like that, so that there's a little bit of black, a little bit of white, and then there's some good amount of mid-tones to work with. And let's bring this up here. Now, the next area that I want to show you is the point curve. So if you click on this little button over on the right-hand side, you will find the point curve, which has an RGB curve that's just like Photoshop. So I click on a point and drag it up, click on another point and drag it down. So now we're working on the actual tone curve itself, and I can be very, very specific about which tones I want where. Very useful area inside of the tone curve panel. That's called the point curve. And inside of point curves, not only do I have an RGB value area, which is just going to increase brightness, decrease brightness, things like that, no color changes, but I can also go into the red, green, and blue channels and play with those specifically, and you can see that it affects only the reds. And this is where you would do some funky work to create some maybe some tone curves that look a little bit more like a cross process. Now there's a lot more to be learned about the tone curve, but I just wanted to point out a few of the tools inside the tone curve and ask you to go into the tone curve area and play. Remember, you are working in a non-destructive environment, which means that you can play without worrying about messing up. You just have to reset. If you found this video helpful, sign up for my newsletter at jaredplatt.com. And if you've already received the newsletter, then share it with a friend, because if you found it helpful, chances are they will too. Thanks for watching. See you next time.